coming today. I guess I would like to thank my co-author, Evan Boone, for his assistance with the presentation. Also want to recognize the National Park Service and their assistance in this long-term effort. This presentation will be a bit different from some of the others you've heard this morning, a little more agency activity perspective rather than strictly a classic research activities. But I'll give you an information on our evaluation of the coastal brook trout life history forms at Isle Royale National Park. And for those of you who are still not aware, I think we've heard 4 or 5 talks about Isle Royale already, but island just up the coast, we're here in Duluth at the red dot. Isle Royale was designated as a national park in 1931. Part of that designation resulted in the complete protection of that habitat, so there has been no development throughout about 98% of the park, with the exception of the 2% for park service infrastructure housing. But the habitat within Isle Royale National Park has not been impacted since about the 1930s. Certainly there was impacts to the park prior to that, logging in particular, fires as a result of logging activities. There was some damming of rivers and floating of logs down 1 or 2 of the streams on the island. So certainly not without impact, but for the most part, very pristine environment. The island as a whole is 72 kilometers long by about 12 kilometers wide at its widest point. So a fairly small area for a variety of different brook trout life history forms. We've heard from a number of talks, the various life history types that we've experienced with brook trout, riverine forms, lacustrine, adfluvial, and anadromous throughout the native range of brook trout. Clearly, we will not be talking about anadromous forms here at Isle Royale, but we will be talking about some of the other 3 forms at Isle Royale. Just want to provide a brief history, a background of the work at Isle Royale. So first surveys were initiated in 1993 at about the time there was growing interest in coastal brook trout throughout the Lake Superior Basin. Sharon provided us a bit of history and information about the growing interest in coasters throughout the Lake Superior Basin. At the time that those surveys began, harvest regulations at the island in Lake Superior waters were 5 brook trout per day with a 25 centimeter size limit. In the streams on the island, it was 10 brook trout per day with an 18 centimeter size limit. So quite liberal regulations at the time. Population dynamics throughout the island were completely unknown. There were angler reports, mainly from Park Service employees, that there were brook trout present in Siskiwit Bay streams, in Washington and Grace Creek harbors, and in Tobin Harbor. And I'll provide you a little bit of context and geographic perspective for these locations. So I've got the island here split into a northeast and a southwest component. Here we see the northeast end of the island, and if you have noticed, the island runs in a parallel direction with the Minnesota shoreline and in that northeast-southwest direction. There's a lot of information on this inset here, but locations I want to point out here have been blocked in with the black boxes. There are several of them that are key in the northeast end of the island. Among those are Tobin Harbor, which I think everybody can probably locate here. Right around the point, Scoville Point, is Rock Harbor. There is Tobin Creek that enters the head of Tobin Harbor, and there's a small stream that comes in. It's Benson Creek. Its watershed is neighboring to that Tobin Creek watershed there on the island. So these are key areas that brook trout were present and that have been surveyed since the mid-1990s, some of them periodically, some of them more regularly, which I'll point out as we go. I should mention that Benson Creek is an intermittent streams, so in dry years that will dry up, and there will be no fish habitat in that system. There is a small lake up at the headwaters, but in those dry years that does not flow out of Benson Lake. Moving to the southwest end of the island, we've got a number of other locations that have been important for brook trout at Isle Royale. I want to point some of those out. Key of those is the Siskiwit Bay area here, which has 3 tributaries that flow into it: Little Siskiwit River, Big Siskiwit River, and there's another river that's just off the map known as Siskiwit River, flows out of Siskiwit Lake. Further to the southwest, Washington Harbor inlet in the southwest end of the island, Grace Harbor just outside of Washington Harbor, and then the 2 streams that supply these 2 harbors, there's Grace Creek here and Washington Creek here on the southwest end. So some of the early exploratory surveys were simply to identify where do we have brook trout populations, how do we put our hands on the fish. Doing that work, there were several areas that we were successful. Tobin Harbor was one of those. You see that image on the right, large coaster in that system. The other areas that we were able to capture fish early on was in the Siskiwit Bay tributaries, those images there on the left. So as a Fish and Wildlife Service agency, first thing we put our minds to when we located fish at Isle Royale was, of course, the development of broodstock. I say that a little bit sarcastically, but that's certainly what agencies tend to do when we encounter populations that are low in abundance, and there's some concern based on regulations that there could be further impacts to those populations. So we developed 2 different broodstocks, one from the Siskiwit Bay streams and one from the Tobin Harbor population. These broodstocks were developed, I don't know if you can quite tell, the gentleman in the green here is literally holding a teaspoon that we are spawning eggs into that teaspoon to try and take a minimal number of eggs from each female. The fish are, each batch of eggs is split into 2 samples, which are fertilized by individual males, so 2 to 1. These are taken back to our isolation facility where they're maintained for a 18-month period before they're brought into our hatchery facilities for production. So in the late 90s through the present day, we've developed Lake Superior Basin broodstock for use in rehabilitation stocking efforts throughout the Lake Superior Basin. Those are used by many of our partner agencies, states and tribes in particular. There was one year when we also returned some of these offspring to Isle Royale in the Siskiwit Bay area of Isle Royale. So during the process of collecting gametes, capturing fish for broodstock production, we learned a fair bit about the different populations at the island. Specifically related to the Siskiwit Bay stock, that spawning was occurring in 3 tributaries around the bay: Big Siskiwit River, Little Siskiwit River, and Siskiwit River. Very creative. There was no evidence of shoreline spawning despite considerable effort of netting and electroshocking along the shoreline of the bay. Spawning occurred in late September and early October. That was in the streams in each of those systems, very similar time period. The females that we were encountering were maturing at between 22 and 25 centimeters. We had some difficulty securing gametes for our hatchery production and eventually abandoned that effort in the Siskiwit Bay stock because it didn't meet some of the criteria that we have in the rehabilitation plan for a recovered population. Mainly the presence of 6-year classes of fish in that population. Another note here is that during this time period we've been tagging fish, and we were seeing no exchange of tagged fish between the 2 populations. The Tobin Harbor stock is the other one I mentioned. In this Harbor, spawning does occur along the shoreline. A similar effort to net the tributaries, net the harbor. We put a lot of effort into learning where this fish spawning, where can we capture ripe females, and that turned out in Tobin Harbor to be along the shoreline. There was no evidence of stream spawning in Tobin Creek. At Tobin Harbor, the spawning has been very consistent to be about the third week of October. So we, at one point in time, we were going out there for 6 weeks during the fall to make sure we captured the extent of the run. The last 2 cycles of our infusion of wild gametes, we've cut it down to about 5 days, and it has worked out tremendously well, especially for the home life. Females in Tobin Harbor are maturing at a much larger size, 32 to 37 centimeters. The population in Tobin Harbor is fairly robust, and it should be qualified perhaps. The numbers of fish that we encounter, I think in most locations in Lake Superior, especially Isle Royale, may be high for our Lake Superior populations, but compared to some of the other information and work you've seen this morning, numbers are still in the double digits. We're very fortunate if we get triple-digit numbers of brook trout in any of these locations. And as I mentioned, we have not seen exchange tagged fish moving between Tobin Harbor and other locations. Certainly we've been collecting tissue samples along with the work, and working primarily with Wendy Lee Stott on much of this work, though prior to that was Mary Burnham Curtis with the USGS Great Lakes Science Center. And the information that we've found is that this is comparing the Isle Royale populations with several other streams in Minnesota and Wisconsin. You see the Isle Royale strains, Isle Royale populations do separate out. There's some grouping together of the streams in the southwest end, and then Tobin Harbor up here by itself. But these stocks are genetically segregated, isolated, at least the Tobin Harbor from the southwest stocks. And we've been maintaining those in the broodstock in the hatchery system separately as a result. So the information that we provided through this first decade or so of a lot of work related to broodstock development was provided to the management agencies, Michigan DNR and the Park Service, and some of the responses related to that information were to implement more conservative harvest regulations. That took place in 1998, implemented a 45 centimeter size limit, 1 per day. And in 2005, both of those agencies chose to go to a catch and release only in Lake Superior and in the tributaries on the island. Maybe I should mention that Isle Royale is somewhat unique in that the state of Michigan manages the Lake Superior fishery, and the National Park Services manages the fisheries in the streams flowing into Lake Superior. So having both agencies on the same page was very helpful. It's the only location in Lake Superior where there is catch and release only for coasters, although most of the agencies have conservative regulations in the lake and up to their first barrier in Minnesota and Ontario anyway. So now I want to take a minute to start focusing on some of these populations that we've been working on. Tobin Harbor assessment has been the key area that we've put our effort. I mentioned it's a long, narrow embayment here on the northeast end of the island. It's about 8 kilometers deep. It's got about 17 kilometers of shoreline, so that gives you an idea of how narrow the harbor is. Maximum depth is 22 meters out at the mouth of the harbor. Substrate is substrate pretty much spans the gamut here. Everything that we might expect to find there. Tobin Creek at the head of the harbor. Substrate in that creek is entirely a clay bottom. As mentioned, there's no evidence of spawning in that system, and we've never even caught a brook trout in Tobin Creek. So for the past 15 or so years, we've had a shoreline electrofishing survey that's been conducted. This is a standardized effort that agencies are now using around Lake Superior in the shoreline areas. This was established out at Isle Royale. The intent of our effort was to describe the current population status, relative abundance, distribution in the harbor, size and age structure. We are collecting tissue samples. We tag these fish and release them on a regular basis. This work is done every year in the month of June. And you see here some of the logistics of just getting our equipment out to the island. The Park Service has been tremendously helpful in making that happen. But it's very difficult to get equipment and people and supplies out here, as well as get them back off the island when the time comes. So sometimes interrupts our sampling efforts. The Shoreline Index Survey, this is again a boat electrofishing survey, covers the entire shoreline of the harbor. You see here we've been doing this now for 17 years, a few years that we missed, but from 2001 through 2018, we have seen a gradual increase in time over that time period. Couple of gaps in there for years when we were unable to get out to the island, but overall positive signs for the population, in particular the last 3 years where we've seen a pretty substantial bump in that relative abundance along the shoreline, up to the tune of 6 or 7 fish per kilometer. The size structure shown here, those fish throughout the harbor, you see they're broken into 5-year time frames here. So first one, 2001 to 2005, 6 to 10, and 11 to 16. Fairly similar size structure throughout the time period, ranging from about 150 up to 450, 500 millimeter size fish. Mean length at age, fairly linear. This has been a challenge for us. We've generally used scale samples. We don't kill any of these fish. But we see some sort of gap there in that 2 to 3 when we think they're changing from to a piscivorous diet, and it's been the primary growth time period. Washington Harbor area, just want to talk a little bit about that effort. 5-kilometer harbor there, max depth about 40, similar substrates. We've also been conducting relative abundance work in that system and pit tagging fish. Our index survey has shown a gradual increase. You'll see some gaps in the years here, but again, some positive signs in recent years. The fish that we've been pit tagging, we have a pit tag detection station in Washington Creek. It's about a kilometer up the river, and we have an antenna station, both detect upstream and downstream movement. What we've found in this system is that of the coasters we've tagged in Washington Harbor, and here you see a little idea of the numbers, 25 coasters over that time period that have been pit tagged. 14 of those were later detected at the pit tag station, indicating that Washington Harbor population is an adfluvial population moving into the system. The earliest ascent by a fish into the creek has been in July. Most of them are moving up in September and August, or September and October when spawning is occurring. And though that's a quick summary of the various life history diversity forms. We've got a lacustrine population in Tobin Harbor. We see adfluvial populations in Washington Harbor and Creek, as well as the Siskiwit Bay and rivers to the bay. And then I didn't get into the riverine populations, but a couple of small streams that are above barriers have brook trout populations persisting in those, in Gray Spence and Little Siskiwit River. With that, I want to thank those that have contributed to this effort over the years, and I can take any questions.